series that's entitled Recapturing the Wonder. What does it look like to have a transcendent faith in a disenchanted world? And if you read sort of at the philosophy, sociology level, they talk about that we live in a post-Christian culture. Christianity is not the dominant part of it anymore. Some people call it Charles Taylor calls it the secular age. And just so we want to say, like, hey, what does it look like to live in our culture, to live in our context? What does it look like to follow Jesus? And when they talk about this sort of secular age, they talk about that the world has been drained of God. It's been drained of anything that's the spiritual, anything that you can't kind of see or feel or touch. Then that doesn't have credibility. Any sort of outside forces that are moving things along, say, like the general understanding of our culture and our context is that those things aren't real. And if those things aren't real, one of the results is that means that we're left on our own. We're left on our own to produce. It's all on us. And when it's all on us and it's on for us to produce, there's no rest. There's no peace. And so one of the ways that I saw this, Corinne and I have been doing, this has just sort of happened. We've been going on a walk/run, interval running we'll call it, maybe more walking than running. But each morning, and so we go out on this walk, and it's been this really great time. Not only are we catching up stuff with like the family and what's going on that day, she's really involved with the church stuff and what's going on with the church and who we're praying for and what's going on. And we get some exercise, and we kind of get on the same. It's been good. And each day we walk down to Cuesta Drive, and if you know the shopping center by like the Gallery Grill, kind of across the street from the Perk, there's Six Flags. Mike has been waiting for me to preach on flags for a long time. I'm not going there, Mike. Just don't get your hopes up. But there are these flags, and two of the flags kind of caught my attention this week. One of the flags, there should be a slide for this, and you can't really see them fly. So one of the flags is right here. It says, "Nobody cares, work harder." This is flag number 1. Okay? This is literally flying over our city. This is representing our city, our community. So again, in this world, it's all on you. Nobody ultimately cares about you. It's all on you. This is exhausting. So, because work harder, it's all on you. Got to go further. So this is exhausting. So, which leads us to flag number 2, which is it's hard to see again. This is our Jimmy Buffett flag that it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Okay. So nobody cares, work harder, which is what? Exhausting and depressing and leaves you feeling anxious and horrible. And so you need what? You need relief, you need rest. Karina calls it like you just need escape. And so, but these are just sort of the dichotomies. So I know I'm talking about like sort of this psychological, sociological, it can get a little nebulous up there. This is the concrete of what that means. Okay, there is no God. It's all on you, so work harder, which leaves you exhausted, and so you need something to escape. We've lived here for about, is it 6 years or 5 years? Almost 6 years now. And I've always tried to put my finger on, like, what is that? What is this? And so it's kind of got this, I love it. It's got this sort of, like, culture of, like, a little laid back, and it's in the beach vibes and salt life and all this stuff. But there's this underlying like drive and competitiveness. I still remember one of our first community groups. We were like, give us one word to describe Jupiter. And you're like in all sermons, BB. BB, my mother-in-law, said competitive. And I was like, oh yeah, it sure is. And so there's just this weird dynamic that goes on in our world of just sort of 5 o'clock somewhere, YOLO, laid back, yet nobody cares. You better work your tail off. Because it's all on you. Again, this leads to exhaustion, so we try to escape. And if we take this one more step in the book, Recapturing the Wonder, he talks about we live in a culture of display. That life is a performance and everything is broadcast. So we're always on display. Whether it's through social media, through what we share, through what we're trying to project when we show up at places. Y'all know if you went to these parent orientations this week, like, you know, you got to show up and you got to, but am I saying the right things? Am I looking the right way? Are my kids sort of behaving enough to get like fool the teachers for at least a week? Like life is a performance and everything is broadcast. And again, you see this on social media. He references a comedian, Louis C.K. You guys familiar with Louis C.K.? So Louis C.K. has this little skit where he talks about that people, when they meet him, he won't take a picture with them. Like, he'll stop and talk with them and have a conversation with them, but he won't take a picture with him. And the people get really angry. Some people get really angry and upset with it. And the point is, people aren't really into meeting Louis C.K. They want to show people that they met Louis C.K., right? It was more about like projecting, of displaying that I did this thing, that I saw this thing, than the actual thing. So people actually got angry with him that he wouldn't take a picture with them. It's this culture of display. We need to show, we need to project. In her book from a while ago called The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt put it this way. She said, a life spent entirely in public, in the presence of others, becomes, as we would say, shallow. While it retains deep visibility, so again, everybody can see it, it loses the quality of rising into sight from some darker ground which must remain hidden if it is not to lose the depth in a very real, non-subjective sense. She said, if we live our lives constantly in the presence of others and for the presence of others, it becomes very shallow. And we never take the important time to be by ourselves, to be with God, take the time to withdraw and disconnect, to think, to process, to prepare. It's where character is developed. It's where we learn who we are, who God is. It's a space where we cultivate intimacy and connection with God that then forms us and shapes us to live the life he calls us to live. But as I talked about last week, like this even seeps into our spirituality, right? We project everything. We broadcast everything. I struggle with it. Like, part of the reason, like, we want people, one of the challenges of this church is like people even being aware that it's here. Well, one way to make people aware of that it's here is what? Social media. That's where people are. So I'm not saying I have the answers to any of this. I'm just saying it's a thing. And so we get into worship service, or maybe you've seen stuff on your feeds, and it's like these big spiritual moments, and it's just projected, and something's lost when everything becomes about showing and displaying. And so in this sort of culture of display, what does it look like to stop? To actually have solitude? To have a time where we cultivate depth in that world of display. And we see it over and over and over again in the scriptures. We're made for it. We need it. And so if we're going to live in this sort of secular age, this disenchanted world, this life that's sort of functionally void of God, what does it look like to take time to be formed by him, to be shaped by him, to live in the world where we can see him and enjoy him and be about his ways? And we see it. We're going to be in Mark chapter 6. We're going to look at the first part of this account where Jesus feeds the 5,000. And we're going to look at, what does this look like? What does Jesus call us to? What does it look like to be re-enchanted, or to experience God in the everyday? Let me read Mark 6:30 to 34. It says, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. It says, and he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. It says, now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. In verse 34, when he got ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And in this passage, we see a few things that we can do to cultivate this life of solitude, to experience God in an intimacy with him, which again allows us to live the rest of life. I'll get to in a minute. It's not like, hey, just sort of become like a monk or a hermit and just like be on your own all the time. There's a call to be with God and then to go out into the world. And when we see this call for solitude, we need to see first and foremost that it's just following in the footsteps of Jesus. I think I put disciples of Jesus follow in the footsteps of Jesus. What we see throughout the Gospels, that Jesus' life is marked as much by withdrawal as with engagement. When you think of Jesus, what do you think of? Him being with people, miracles, bringing restoration, bringing healing, preaching, teaching. But if you go through the Gospel of Mark, if you go through any of the Gospels, there is over and over and over again, Jesus withdraws to be by himself. Right after Jesus is baptized, what does he immediately do? He immediately goes out into the desert for 40 days. Right before his crucifixion, where's Jesus? He's in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he's actually even there with his disciples. And what does he do there? He even goes away from them there. He's like, hey, you stay here. I'm going over there to be with the Father. Even this account comes on the heels of the death of John the Baptist. So he goes through what? Something traumatic, something hard. And what does he do? He retreats to be by himself with his followers. We see this all throughout Jesus' life, that it's marked by withdrawal as much as engagement. If you look at Mark 1:35, it's almost like reflective of this verse. But it says of Jesus, and rising early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. So when Jesus calls us to a life of solitude, we're just following in the footsteps of what he has done. And two things we see with Jesus withdrawing to be by himself. One thing, Jesus was busy. Like, you ever think about that? Jesus had things vying for his time. He had people vying for his attention. After it says that he withdrew, it says the disciples were searching for him. They were like seeking him out. Parents, you ever feel that way? You you find a little corner of the house where like the kids don't know you're there yet, and then what do? They like search you, man. They seek you out. So the disciples were searching for him, just as the people in our account in Mark 6. What are the people doing? They're searching for them. They're seeking them, and the disciples find Jesus and they say, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus was busy. Jesus had things vying for his time, but Jesus knew that he needed solitude. He needed time to be alone, to rest, to be restored, to be with the Father. And in Jesus doing this would be the second thing. It reveals what it means to be human. I'll share this quote, but Jesus withdrawing and needing to be restored wasn't a sign of like weakness or him not being God. It was actually a sign that he was human, a perfect human. And if Jesus was the perfect image of God and followed God perfectly and showed us what it means to follow God, if he needed solitude, if he needed time, we need it too. Cosper in the book, Recapturing the Wonder, put it this way. He says, a body has limited resources, and what we do each day depletes these resources. Our physical energy, our psychological energy, our capacity for empathy. Anybody get less empathetic the longer the day goes? And even our capacity to make decisions. There's this study that was done of they studied people that were on parole, and they saw like they had very similar sentences, and then they looked at like, hey, why did one person get parole and why did the other person not get parole? It was not based on anything. It was all based on the time of day. More people got parole earlier in the day, where people could actually listen to and process what was going on. Less people got off parole, got whatever. They had to go back to jail later in the day. Why? Because people get depleted. They were worn out. It says Jesus, incarnate and embodied, experienced these limits. And just as he needed food and oxygen and sleep, he needed solitude. And he says, saying this doesn't accuse Jesus of a flaw or an imperfection. Instead, it points out that being perfectly human means being contingent, requiring food and rest and solitude in order to live perfectly. Humanity isn't limitless and self-sufficient, but deeply dependent on God's provision. We need solitude. That's why nobody cares, work harder, actually it just does not work. You wonder why people are running around like anxious and angry and upset all the time. I'd be angry, upset, and anxious if I really thought that nobody cares and I just needed to work harder. But God does care. God does love us. And solitude is a gift that he gives us, and it's necessary to be fully human. It's necessary to actually live. I just caught Matt. We have this Whoop thing, and then I have this watch. One of my favorite things about it is it like tracks all this stuff. I love like tracking sleep and tracking exercise, and I was looking at some of it, and like seriously, if I like drink coffee at a certain time, if I don't exercise a certain day or amount, like I can look at my sleep and it's just like all thrown off. Like we need it. We need solitude. We need Sabbath. We need rest to be fully human, to be alive. We were talking to doctors and some therapists and stuff, and one person told Karina, you need to embrace your humanness. You need to embrace your humanness. How's that for like a diagnosis? Because why? The world says don't embrace your humanness. Work harder. Nobody cares. Jesus loves us, and he showed us what it means to be truly human, and he allows us to live that way as well. This is point 2. I mentioned this with Brian. Disciples of Jesus need a clear understanding of their calling. In verse 30, it says, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. If you flip back one page, you could look at, maybe you don't even have to flip. You could look at verse 7 of chapter 6. It says that he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over unclean spirits. Jesus had called his disciples to go make disciples, to go preach the gospel, go bring restoration. They understood what they were called to do. This whole chapter 6, what we see, that calling is just an extension of what Jesus was doing in the first 5 chapters. Jesus was out preaching the gospel and bringing restoration. And then he calls his disciples, his followers, to do the same thing. And as followers of Jesus, we're called and empowered to share that same authority, to share that ministry of Jesus, to be about what Jesus is about. That's what our calling is. In one of the helpful books that I read in our time away, called The Rest of God by Mark Buchanan, he says, in order to keep the Sabbath well, in order to have solitude, to have rest, to embrace the rest of God, we need a right view of work or vocation. Without a rich theology of labor, we'll have an impoverished theology of rest. We'll find that both are hectic, sporadic, and chaotic, and we'll find no joy in either. That's why the work harder, nobody cares, and it's 5 o'clock somewhere, doesn't work. The work becomes sporadic and chaotic and hectic, and so does the rest. And so we need to know what God has called us to in order to know what we need to stop and what we need to not do. There's a general calling that God's given us to what? Love God, love people. So we can all just stop and say, like, hey, what does it look like for me to love God, to be with God, to follow God? What does it look like for me to love the people? Who has God given me to love? Another way to say it is all disciples are called to know Jesus and make Jesus known. A little like shorthand version for me of calling was that God calls me first to be a Christian, then he calls me to be a husband, then he calls me to be a father, and then he calls me to be a pastor. My vocation. Like, it's in that order. Now what happens where I don't have rest, where I don't have solitude, where I don't have Sabbath, where I'm frantic, where it's busy and chaotic, is when the pastor thing goes above the rest of it. It becomes about, what do I need to do? What do I need to accomplish? How do we grow? How do we do all this stuff? Who do I need to make sure that everything's okay? And pastor goes ahead of things. Or kids can get busy and there's lots of needs, and so what happens? So your kids become more important than your marriage. And the thing your kids need most is a healthy marriage. And all those things can become more important than our time with God. Because God's not like yelling at you, vying for your attention. Everything else seems to be, correct? So we need to be intentional and know what God has called us to call us to be about. That's why I love Brian sharing. Like, hey, God has gifted me in these things. I love soccer, had a huge impact on my life. When I was in middle school or high school, there was people that invested in me and changed the trajectory of my life. And guess what he's doing now? Same thing. That's what he's doing. I had the pleasure of grabbing lunch with Travis, who is leaving for Baylor. He's going to college this year. And just to hear him talk about trying to figure out his calling. Hey, I think God's calling me towards these things. I'm going to that's what you do in college. You're trying to figure out, hey, what is God calling me to do? How can I follow him? How can I help others follow him as well? We need to know what God has called us to. Like, you are not called to the same things that I'm called to. But God is calling you to, what does it look like for you to love him and to love others wherever you are? 1 Corinthians 7 put it this way: each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. The place. Where has God called you? What has God assigned to you? What has God called you to in this stage of life? This is constantly changing. This is constantly moving. But if we're going to have any sort of solitude, if we're going to have any sort of rest, we need to know what we're called to do and what we're called not to do. Who has God made you? Third thing, in order to cultivate depth and get solitude, disciples of Jesus need time with Jesus. Look at verse 31. It says, and he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. The NIV version says, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place. So they were busy, they were healing, they were preaching the gospel, they were living their lives. And what does Jesus do when they come back? He's like, hey, Jesus, let me tell you about all the stuff that we've did. Let me tell you what we do. What did Jesus tell them to do? I just had Nora Jones come in my head. I will not sing for you. He says, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place. It doesn't, what, you say, oh yeah, good, you guys worked really hard. Go work harder. No. You did what I called you to do. Now come rest. Be with me. He says, go to a desolate place. It literally is a desert. I looked up desolate. It means it's deserted of people and in a state of bleak and dismal emptiness. When I think of like the quiet place, I'm thinking like Juno Beach, like at 7 o'clock on a Sunday when there's nobody else there. He says just go to the desert where there's like literally nothing else there. So maybe you're like going 10 miles into JD or something. I don't know. What he's driving at is that we need alone time with God. Just to be with him. And this is like the real challenge. He kind of gets into this in the book. The real reason we don't like alone time, to be quiet, is that we have to deal with ourselves. We blame it on the phones and we blame it on all this stuff. Why do we have all that? So we don't have to be alone with ourselves and all of our crazy thoughts and heart. It's hard. Have you ever just sat there and tried to be quiet and alone for more than like 5 minutes? It's difficult. But it's in that space. That's where Arndt called it that darker ground. That God reminds us of who he is. He exposes who we are and brings redemption and restoration. It's where God works to form us and shape us. When Jesus is teaching his disciples to pray in Matthew 6, he says to pray in secret. He says the religious leaders love to be seen. They love to live their lives on display. But he says, go into your closet. And I think part of that is because that's what we need. Cosper in his book talks about solitude or withdrawal or disconnection. It provides a way of making space for truly intimate personal relationship with God. It is the darker ground in which our faith is nourished and nurtured. God uses that solitude, that darker ground to nourish us and nurture us. And we don't just go into solitude just to avoid things, to retreat, to steer clear of the world. Oh, yeah, we need to isolate and be alone because it's a big, bad world and it's dark. And he's like, no, like, you're the light of the world. But you know how you become light of the world? You spend time with the light of the world. Right? What happened to Moses? He goes up the mountain. He's face to face with God, and what does he come by? He's like glowing. Why? Because he was in the presence of God. God nourishes us. He nurtures us. He transforms us. He shapes us in places of solitude. Cosper says that solitude was the hidden ground from which Jesus' ministry arises. Again, he was in the desert. And then what happens? Satan comes and tempts him. I always kind of read that, look how great Jesus is. Like, he's tired, he's famished, he's on his own. He's at his weakest and most vulnerable. Cosper's like, no, actually, he was with the Father for 40 days, so he's actually at his strongest. He had great strength, and that's how he stands up to the devil. He had dwelt on God's word. From the garden, he was so focused, he was sweating blood. And where does he go next? He goes to the cross. It's in solitude. It's in that time with God that our ministry arises. Even this account, what does he do? He withdraws, goes to a quiet place, and what do? Feed 5,000 people. That's how the story ends. It's out of the solitude. It's out of the aloneness. It's out of the disconnection that God works through us. It's through solitude that we're fueled to follow Jesus. And so we need regular solitudes, like weekly. That's what Sabbath is. We need daily solitudes, little things that we stop each morning. We're going to spend that time and be with God throughout the day. Again, I knock technology and all that stuff, but the part about like this guy, this stupid little thing that says like, hey, take a minute to just stop. Right? I like the little rings that tell me to do more. Like, oh yeah, get 30 minutes of exercise, burn 1,000 calories just from walking around or whatever. Like, the one that kind of annoys me is the one that tells me to stop for a minute and just think. We need little solitudes throughout the day. We need extended times periodically to just stop. It was just a sweet, healthy time for us to be able to go away for 3 weeks. We had time just to sort of get out of everything and be together, to be with God, to have quiet. Like, I love it for Katie and Zach, who are just like, hey, he's working from home, so they're like 3 months just to go away. Why? Like, their life has been hectic. There's been a lot going on. So just get it. Like, I know none of us, like, not all of us can take 3 weeks or 3 months or whatever. But what does it look like to get periodic times of solitude, of Sabbath, of rest, of time to be with Jesus? And again, that's going to look different for everybody at different times, but we need it. And the last point that we see here is that disciples of Jesus have the power and the ability to stop. We don't have a mentality that nobody cares and we need to work harder. We have the mentality that we have a God who deeply cares, who loves us, and who is at work in and through us. He says in the end of 31, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. One of the proclamations of being a follower of Jesus is that you know him as Lord. And that means when we know him as Lord, it should be on the screen, Colossians 1:16, we believe that all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. In him, all things hold together. Sometimes I like to sing little kid songs. He has the whole world in his hands. He's sovereign. He's over it. He's controlling it. He's okay without you. And that's not like because you don't matter. It's because like, no, you matter immensely. You can stop. One of the kind of like struck me in some of my reading in our time away in that book, The Rest of God, I thought about it as like loose ends. Anybody else struggle with loose ends? Karina lovingly told me last week, she's like, you need to close loops. Some of you are aware of this. I'll send a text, hey, what about this, and this? Might get a response back, and then I fail to respond again, right? Or I'll start something, hey, we should go do this, and then, okay, is that set up? Like, no, you're like, you need to close the loops. So I live in a world of like loose ends. I'm terrible at tying up loose ends, but I'm always trying. Buchanan said it this way. He says, it's a sheer gift. It is a stop work order, talking about Sabbath, talking about solitude, Sabbath particularly. It is a stop work order in the midst of a work that's never complete and never polished. Sabbath is not the break we're allotted at the tail end of completing all our tasks and chores, the fulfillment of all our obligations. Anybody else feel this way? I will stop when everything is done. And if I happen to get all things done that week, then I'll stop. If I don't get it all this week, guess what? I'm going to keep going. But when he talks about this Sabbath, this weekly rest, he says it's the rest we take smack dab in the middle of them, without apology, without guilt. I love this, and for no better reason than God told us we could. Why are you going to not tie up your loose ends? Because God told me I could. So like ladies, like you want to take a nap this afternoon? You think like, oh, don't you have some stuff to do? Nope. God told me to take a nap. Not doing it. Don't you love that? There's constantly loose ends. Life never stops. But we're Christians. We're followers of Jesus who holds all things together. And he gave us permission, he gave us a gift every week to stop. And it's for no better reason than God told us we could. Pastor up in New York, Rick Villadez is how I believe you pronounce his last name. He says, Sabbath is one of the clearest signs of the gospel of grace. You intentionally accomplish nothing, and God still loves you. Such good news. Every week when we practice Sabbath, when we stop for a whole day, it's a reminder of the gospel of grace. We don't tie up the loose ends. We don't need to accomplish anything, and God still loves you. You know what the world loves? Work harder. Do more. Accomplish more. And that's what we get when we view the world void of God. When we view the world void of the transcendent. Functionally, it's all on you. You can't stop. But when we view the world through the lens of the gospel of grace, the free gift of life through trusting in Jesus, it brings rest. We're cared for. We're loved. God will provide. God will accomplish his purposes. And all this is a gift from Jesus. You see, Jesus understood his calling, and it brings us life. Part of his calling, Jesus lived to bring us life. This was his calling. John 10:10, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. How do we get life? How do we attain life? Not by working harder, but by accepting Jesus' life for us. Jesus understood his calling, and he died to pay the penalty for our sin. He died for people who wanted to function as if there is no God. This is the good news of the gospel. In sin, we replace God. We want to be on the throne. The good news of the gospel, God takes our position. He becomes sin. He takes our place. 1 Timothy 1:15, Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. He understood his calling. He knew what he was coming to do. And through Jesus, we can come and find rest. This is the good news. This is the message. He says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, all of you who live in a world that says nobody cares and work harder. He says, I will give you rest. That's the good news. That's what we live in light of. That's why we can stop. Let's pray.